Binghe immediately turned back. Does Shizun have any other instructions? The dorms are that way, said Shen Qingqiu. Why are you walking in the other direction? The disciples' dormitories and the woodshed were both a left turn out the door, yet Luo Binghe had turned to the right. This disciple wants to go to the kitchen first to prepare tomorrow's breakfast for Shizun, said Luo Binghe. Shen Qingqiu was in a bind. He really wanted to eat Luo Binghe's breakfast, but having a child cook for him instead of sleeping when it was already so late at night. Didn't that sound like Cinderella and her stepmother? Either way, it seemed inhuman. In the end, Shen Qingqiu's conscience won over his stomach. He coughed. Nonsense. It's the middle of the night. What is there to cook? Go back and sleep. Luo Binghe knew his master was worried about him not resting enough and agreed with a smile, but he still planned to sneak off to the kitchen to work later. Shen Qingqiu wanted to ask him if he was still sleeping in the woodshed, but after mulling it for a moment, he concluded that youths still had their dignity. Asking him outright would be embarrassing. Moreover, even if he had Luo Binghe sleep in the disciples' dorm, the other students would take Mingfan's lead and bully him, steal his blankets, and hide his shoes or whatnot. The poor thing. Tomorrow pack your things and come here, said Shen Qingqiu before Luo Binghe left. At first, Luo Binghe didn't understand what he meant. Shizun? There's a side room in the bamboo house. Starting tomorrow, you can move in there, Shen Qingqiu said. If Luo Binghe lived a little closer, then in the future it would be easy to have him make breakfast and clean up around the house. Shen Qingqiu's adaptability was, as always, as incredible as record-breaking Dick. Just a moment ago, he had been unable to even look Luo Binghe in the face, but now he dared to scheme how to make the great protagonist wait on him hand and foot, serve his tea, carry his water, wash his clothes, fold his blankets, etc. Being in the middle of fantasizing, he had noticed said protagonist's reaction. Suddenly, Luo Binghe pounced on him like a tiger, capturing him in a tight embrace. Caught off guard, Shen Qingqiu jumped in surprise. Then his face reddened. For the first time in his life, someone had wrapped him in a full-bodied embrace. And it wasn't a warm and gentle jaded-skinned maiden, but a youth brimming with tyrannical energy. Ah! Shizun! Shizun! Overflowing with happiness, Luo Binghe hugged him around the neck and refused to let go, crying in his ear over and over. Shen Qingqiu didn't know where to put his hands. After floundering for a bit, he placed them on Luo Binghe's head and stroked his hair. All right, you've cried out to me, hugged me, and made all this racket, and you aren't even embarrassed. You're already so big, it's not like you're a 10-year-old child. How do you think this looks? Luo Binghe hadn't thought about it that deeply. When it was put that way, he grew suddenly ashamed. If he hadn't been overcome by a torrent of joy, he would never have dared to treat his normally aloof and removed Shizun like this. Though reluctant, he hurried to peel himself from Shen Qingqiu's body, his whole face red. Yes, this disciple has overstepped. When it came to asking for hugs, children under the age of 10 were moe, but the 15-year-old Luo Binghe was still moe. With a fresh, tender face like this handsome little sprout's, anything you did would be moe. Luo Binghe floundered for a while, at first a little flustered, but then he noticed that Shen Qingqiu's complexion didn't look particularly good. Even though Shen Qingqiu had the immortal body of a cultivator, he was still haunted by his old injuries and a lingering poison. Then, because of Luo Binghe, he had been dragged into Menmo's dream realm. He hadn't rested properly and was at his limit, so of course he looked a little bit haggard. Luo Binghe didn't dare interfere with Shen Qingqiu's rest any longer and grudgingly said his goodbyes. Nevertheless, he didn't return to the woodshed, but instead took a detour before going to the kitchen. He promised himself that for the next long while, he would carefully watch over his master's diet and recuperation. As soon as Luo Binghe stepped out of the room, a system notification arrived. Protagonist, satisfaction, points, plus 50. Shen Qingqiu was mystified. Why add another 50? System lag? Or had the system finally discovered its conscience and concluded it had given him too little before? Whatever, he was exhausted, so what if the points were added? Oi, there was no way his admittedly great self had earned that 50 with a single hug. The next day, Shen Qingqiu hadn't yet slept as long as he wanted before the fragrant scent of fish and rice wafted into his room and tempted him awake. Outside of the bamboo house, Luo Binghe had spent long hours preparing a meal with utmost care. The scent drew in a great number of Qingjing Peak's disciples who were used to eating bland food. They hid off to the side, snooping. Enraged, Mingfan and the others chewed their sleeve hems while watching the scene unfold, especially when Shen Qingqiu sat at the table affectionately saying praises to Luo Binghe for his efforts and handiwork. As the two blissfully smiled at each other, their audience's grief and resentment reached its peak. Utterly shameless, to use his licentious schemes and unorthodox methods to curry Shizun's favor. That evening, when Luo Binghe moved his things into the side room of Shen Qingqiu's house, every last one of Qingjing Peak's disciples who had bullied Luo Binghe were wiped out. It was as if they had been struck by lightning from a clear sky, leaving their corpses scattered across the field. Though the words were moved his things, in truth, it was only Luo Binghe moving himself. From the beginning, he'd never really had anything in the woodshed. His pillow, well, he had rested his head upon a bundle of straw he had found there, and blankets, his outer robes had covered him. And of course, Shen Qingqiu had prepared the real deal for him already. Shen Qingqiu had always thought that Luo Binghe's life was unbearably miserable, just like a textbook case of child abuse. Changqiu Mountain sect was one of the major sects in the cultivation world. How could people's hearts have grown so dark in such a place? How could their resources be so lacking? That night, Luo Binghe lay on a normal bed for the first time in his life. Before, he had laid in a wooden basin floating down an icy river, then on a cold damp ground, then between noisy streets, and then even in mountain caves while roughing it out in the wild. It had become normal. Conversely, now that he was sleeping on a soft and tidy bamboo bed, his entire body felt light and floaty, like none of this was even real. It was especially unreal when he thought of Shen Qingqiu sleeping in the main room just a wall away. That night, perhaps because Luo Binghe had too much on his mind, Menmo didn't appear in his dream realm. So Luo Binghe remained composed and waited. Sure enough, a few days later, Menmo appeared once more. This time, Menmo didn't set up some mysterious barrier, having not intended to hide in the first place. Instead, he appeared directly in Luo Binghe's dream, though he did it so in the form of a cloud of black mist. This cloud of black mist expanded and contracted before Luo Binghe's eyes, endlessly transforming, and that aged voice echoed from within it.
So, what have you decided in these 3 days, boy?
Does Senior Menmo not know my decision? Luo Binghe replied. Menmo chuckled.
You have chosen a path you definitely won't regret. Remember this day, boy. Today is the beginning of your meteoric rise.
What youth didn't dream of meteoric success? Menmo's words rang with grand heroic spirit. But Luo Binghe was unmoved. He only cupped his fist and bowed. This junior has one more request.
What is it? Out with it. Hurry up and finish so you can finally become my apprentice.
Menmo urged him on, not realizing that he was being far too optimistic. That is precisely what this junior wanted to speak about, said Luo Binghe. My master treats me with utmost kindness. I really can't apprentice under anyone else without his permission.
Fine.
Menmo interrupted before he could finish, at the end of his patience.
This elder won't demand the titles of master and apprentice. Is that enough?
Has any extraordinary master ever come away with a worse deal? He was falling over himself to teach someone his people's techniques. Yet he wouldn't even get to hear his student call him 师傅. How was his plight any different from that of an absolutely devoted yet bitterly suffering concubine who couldn't gain official status? 罗宾河 smiled. Then many thanks to Senior. He wasn't remotely willing to call anyone other than 沈清秋 师尊. As he eyed 罗宾河, 孟魔 was sure that if he still had a physical body, his nose would have gone crooked with rage. This 罗宾河 was all cute and obedient in front of his master, just like a little white lotus. So then why was he so hard to deal with for any other person? Two completely different faces. He was practically a different person.
Oh, this elder is gonna die of rage.
Time flew like an arrow, the sun and the moon alternating back and forth like a weaver's shuttle. Shen Qingqiu really didn't want to use such a worn-out saying, but he couldn't find a better phrase. Every day on Qingjing Peak, he played the guqin, read books, wrote calligraphy, painted paintings, practiced his cultivation, occasionally nitpicked Luo Binghe's food, occasionally bickered or sparred with Liu Qingge, and from time to time reported on his work to Yue Qingyuan. The days flew by, perfectly in sync with his life goal of idling away to a ripe old age. Until the Immortal Alliance Conference finally arrived. In the end, this day really did dawn. Shen Qingqiu had been too carefree. He'd forgotten about the first major climax of the novel. The first step of Luo Binghe's climb to the top, on his journey to marrying every ideal woman, as well as his first step towards his blackened heart, after which his soul would never again be washed clean, and he had actually managed to forget it. So when Shen Qingqiu received the gilded invitation, he stared at it, in shock, for a long time. The Immortal Alliance Conference was Proud Immortal Demon's Way's first major climax. At the same time, it was also an important turning point in the novel. The conference was held once every 4 years, and it was an excellent opportunity for cultivators to pick out new talent, or for said new talent to establish their reputation. Before every conference, the major sect leaders conducted discussions, and although the exact structure of the proceedings differed, there was always a list of top rankers, whether you came from a prestigious sect or from the poorest parts of the martial arts world. As long as your performance at the conference was outstanding, your name would be inscribed in gold upon a tablet, and you become renowned across the land. Before this event, Proud Immortal Demon's Way's performance online had been steadfastly lukewarm. But once the Immortal Alliance Conference debuted, the reviews, comments, subscriptions, and tips all soared into the heavens. Well, it wasn't only because from that point forward, Great Master Airplane Shooting Towards the Sky abandoned the last of his already minimal moral principles and poured women upon women into the story, adding interminable sections of titillating descriptions and blush-inducing, barely legal passages one after another. There was another important it factor. It was, in fact, the main element that had first compelled Shen Qingqiu to follow the novel until the end. The demonic beasts. The reason Great Master Airplane Shooting Towards the Sky, an author who hadn't even properly researched cultivation settings and was often confused as to whether characters were at the foundation establishment or the nascent soul stages, rarely received straight man scolds on this element because the cultivation setting wasn't the selling point of this novel. Instead of being categorized as a cultivation novel, Proud Immortal Demon Way should have been called a monster fighting novel. The fighting component completely outweighed the cultivation component. As a cultivation novel, it was through and through filled with landmines, but as a monster handbook, it was pretty entertaining. To the point, very soon Shen Qingqiu would directly face the savage monsters who came in all shapes and sizes, as described in the book. More importantly, very soon it would be time for him to personally, mercilessly strike Luo Binghe, his demonic heritage revealed, into the endless abyss. The gears of fate, the plot, had already started to turn.